What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria. Two roommates who spent the better part of an evening debating where the phrase, "in my wheelhouse," came from. What is a house of wheels? Why do we have wheels in special little houses? What does it mean to be outside of the house? And we'd like to be your book friends.
This is a podcast for the books we just can't shut up about. And this week, we can't shut up about Nobody's Normal: How Culture Created the Stigma of Mental Illness by Roy Richard Grinker. This is a hefty nonfiction book in which Grinker explores the evolving attitudes towards mental illness throughout history and where the idea of mental illness came from in the first place.
Yeah, so this is a nonfiction book. If you haven't read it, we invite you to read it, but there's really no spoilers because it's history. But yeah, welcome whether you've read it or not.
And if you'd like to support the show, you can rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. If you go down to the links in our show notes and click on one of the book links, that will take you to our affiliate page on bookshop.org, where if you buy any book, we get a very small kickback. And if you would like to join the club, the book club, if you'd like to become a member, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv, where you can find behind the scenes stuff. You can find our film club series where we review book to TV or film adaptations. You can find our archived episodes, all kinds of juicy stuff, and we would love to have you there.
Okay, so let's talk about Nobody's Normal.
Yes.
Which, on the cover, from, judging books by covers as we do, it's a really cute looking book.
It's very cute.
It looks like, it's large, it looks a little academic-y, but it has these fun little polka dots everywhere, and a very catchy tagline. Definitely feels like one, if you see it in like a bookstore, you'd be like, ooh, what is this? Not knowing this book has 100 pages of footnotes and citations.
Yeah.
I started reading this several weeks ago. I knew we were doing it on the podcast, but honestly, I'm still working through it. I have like 80 pages left, but I have read most of it. And Julia has, honest to God, written like 2 full papers heavily citing and referencing this book. So she basically has the knowledge of like 3 people who've read it combined into one. So I'm here for the ride, and you're all in good hands, dear listener. Yeah, but in summary, I guess, it's a fairly approachable nonfiction book, in my opinion. Definitely pretty long, gets into some academic territory, but I think it's pretty fairly accessible to like a general reader, especially if you have a bit of grounding in either mental illness and disability or social anthropology or specifically veterans issues. There's a whole section on war psychology and the impact on veterans. So yeah, if any of those topics interest you and you have some grounding in that, I think the book is fairly accessible. If you have no clue about any of the things in this book, it might be a little bit of a more challenging read.
Or just like if you, like us, are mentally ill,
If that's your grounding in mental illness, you are.
Learn your history. We all deserve to know where we came from. So I read this for my thesis, and as Victoria said, I also used it for 2 of my papers this semester. So I've been spending a lot of quality time with this book, like a lot of time. And I will say up front, I do have a bit of a complicated relationship with Grinker's work, but I do think his research facilitates a lot of very important conversations, which is what we're going to do today.
So a little bit more about our author before we dive in. So Roy Richard Grinker, what a difficult name for me to say. Too many R's. He is an American author and professor of anthropology and international affairs at George Washington University. Are you counting the number of R's?
There's 5 R's in his name!
I know. It's hard. Anyways, he is an author of several books, including Unstranged Minds, Remapping the World of Autism. And throughout Nobody's Normal, we get a look at some of Grinker's family background that he includes in the book. His great-grandfather, grandfather, and father were all psychiatrists. Notably, his grandfather studied under Freud and founded the psychiatry department at the University of Chicago. I found that stuff really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Freud is a complicated guy, and I feel like I learned about him from like 7 different angles when I was in college. Like, Freudian analysis of literature was very different than my Psych 101 class, where the professor just ripped Freud apart and said none of his ideas stand. And then reading this, where it's like all about like his influence in the field and his influence specifically on Grinker's grandfather. I don't know. He's fascinating. So if you think you know stuff about Freud, take that with you. But as you're reading this book, you may get a different perspective on him. If you're like me and only had like a few introductions from different fields.
Dude, the picture you get of him as a person from like an interpersonal interaction is so interesting. You're just like, huh.
Like, self-importance, quirkiness, dedication. Yeah, this book is by no means a biography on Freud. He's only in like 1 chapter. But anyways, I digress. So as an anthropologist, Grinker has conducted extensive research on hunter-gatherers in Central Africa, Northern Korean defectors in South Korea, and the epidemiology of autism. Which, okay, I thought I understood the word epidemiology, and then I realized reading this book that I think I had a very low-level understanding. Is it like the study of the prevalence of certain diagnoses and like how we measure them? Because I don't know. We heard a lot about epidemiology with coronavirus.
I believe it's the measurement of illness as a statistics discipline.
Okay, I did a quick Google from oxfordlanguages.com. We get the branch of medicine which deals with the incidence, distribution, and possible control of diseases and other factors relating to health. So yeah, the measurement. Grinker started studying autism and mental illness more intensely after his daughter was diagnosed as autistic back in the mid-90s. Yeah, that's where I'm going to leave it for now, so we can get into what the book is actually about, but hopefully that gives you a little background into Grinker's perspective.
Yeah, so he introduces this book with his family history, as we've said, and he was meant to sort of pick up the family business, as it were. But instead he became an anthropologist of mental illness to study the family business, which, close enough.
And did he, marry a psychiatrist, too?
Yeah, his wife is a psychiatrist. So he has a lot of insider knowledge, personal experience about how the perception, diagnosis, and treatment of mental health has changed over time, and how it was created by European colonizers in the 17th century. And so in this book, Grinker covers the invention of mental illness and the divisions of mind and body, as well as the divisions of gender and race and class. It's all connected. That these divisions that led to the first diagnoses of madness or insanity or hysteria, these sort of blanket terms that we use more metaphorically now and don't really think of them as being anything. Those were the sort of first diagnostic terms. And then we follow the sort of major North American/European wars of the 20th century and how those wars shaped the development of psychiatry and created the idea of the quote-unquote normal person. Normal, to describe a person, was not a thing until World War II. Very, very recent. And how those wars changed the understanding of mental illness into what we have today. And then finally, Grinker covers some contemporary topics such as normalizing of depression, global language for mental illness in different places, and neurodiversity. And he discusses some of the ways of putting the ideal of normal behind us, because as the title suggests, it's really a spoiler, the title. Nobody's normal. It's not a thing, right? And it is interesting that the title, you don't really get to the idea of normal in the title until the end of the second section. You're 2/3 of the way through the book before normal is invented.
Yeah, I was flipping through the index to prepare for this episode, and I was stunned. I was definition of normal, page 130. I was it took us 130 pages to get there. He introduces it in his introduction. Mm-hmm. He gives you a flavor of what's to come. But it is, it's fascinating that we don't get to he's teasing you with this title, Nobody's Normal, for quite a while until we get into what normal is. So we'll start there. What is normal?
Look at us transitioning like pros. We can start with a quotation from the book. We can see how Grinker defines it. He says, "Normal was a mathematical term that meant average, and where it was used in everyday life, as in the phrase, quote-unquote, normal school, for the training of K through 12 teachers, it meant the beliefs and knowledge shared by the average members of society. Not until World War II and the decade that followed did normality become an ideal, with scores of lay and expert pundits offering Americans their advice on how to be normal.
So I have talked about this maybe on the podcast before, but Julia's definitely heard me say this about 17 times. I had this math textbook in like the 7th or 8th grade, and it had word problems in it. And one of the word problems was, something along the lines of, if 52 students are normal and 135 are abnormal, what is the blah, 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 blah? Like, the setup was there was more abnormal students than normal. Uh-huh. And I was like, this is ridiculous, because I had the understanding, which most Americans do, that normal means the majority.
Yeah.
Normal means the ideal or the consensus, where in fact, I think this textbook was playing a little linguistic trick on us, because they probably meant the statistical meaning of normal, which would be kind of that center point of what is normal, but actually it's smaller than the whole sample, right? It's not the majority of the sample, it's the normal, the average. So anyways, I had that realization reading this book, is like, I think whatever nerd was writing this math textbook was having a joyful time writing these problems.
And they probably were trying to prove a point that you then internalized and have talked about several times since.
It's deeply influenced my understanding.
Yes.
As a kid, I was like, this is inaccurate. Normal needs to be the majority. And then as I got older, I was like, no, why be normal when you can be abnormal?
Yeah.
So Grinker talks about 3 developments that propelled the concept of normal in American culture during this time of like post-World War II, or like, the decades after. And when reading the book, this part was so fascinating to me, especially part 1 are these statues of Norma and Norman. In summary, there was an attempt to find like the statistical average-sized man and woman in America, which is really the average size of white men and women in America, by the sexologist Robert Latow Dickinson and the artist Abram Belsky. And we will link in the show notes a Twitter thread that has pictures of these statues. Have you looked at these before?
I immediately looked them up when I read it, because he describes how weird they look. And I was like, I gotta see this. And I opened it up, and I think he had overplayed how weird they look, because then I was like, oh, well, they just look like someone was bad at making statues. Like, that, you know what I mean? It, like, didn't look, I don't know. It was just like, oh, well, hands are hard, like, it's okay.
Okay, my first thought was, were these measurements self-reported? Because these men were reporting some above average, in my opinion, penis lengths. If this is the statistical average, how long were the people who were above average? Like, that's insane. I don't know more than maybe like 2 women who ever have that perky of boobs without any support going on. Like, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's probably a measurement of what the average American reports rather than what it actually is.
Like, do you think these men were like stripping down in front of the sexologist while he like measured the length?
No.
Like, I don't think so. Maybe. I don't know. I can't speak to the research methods of this project.
It's a weird ass project to begin with. Like, why?
So the follow-up to this, or kind of adding on to this story, is that later there was a Cleveland newspaper that had a competition to find the closest living example of Norma. So it was like 3,800 women who submitted, again, self-reported measurements to this newspaper. And the winner, who's like highlighted as like this very average woman, doesn't actually look that much like the statue. Like, if she's the closest there is, and it's very evident that she's not quite there. Like, it looks, in the picture they have an image of her standing next to the statue. They're about the same size, like height. This is the 1940s. So the real life woman is wearing like shorts and a tank top, because we're not going to be revealing too much skin. So we can't really tell about the torso size. But, like, she's got wider hips, she has wider thighs, she has wider calves, and her fingers aren't as long.
No, the hands are the weirdest part, for sure,
yeah.
On those statues. Basically, the point is, they're not internally cohesive as human statues. Like, the statistical average of hand size and torso length and foot size and nose shape and whatever, right? The combination of those averages does not exist in one person. An individual person is going to be internally consistent. You know what I mean? Like, you're gonna be proportional to yourself. And no one is gonna fit this particular weird combination of all the averages. Like, that's the point.
The point of the time was very much like, let's find the normal. Like, let's find the average. This is also very, heavily in the eugenics era. So, like, keep that in mind. This is the era where it's like, how can we scientifically prove that white people are the, dominant master race? So that's like, it's all tied up in grossness as well.
Yeah, but as we'll see, so the next point is that they're trying to prove that white people are the standard, but they're also only pulling from statistics of white people. So they're creating, it's dumb. But there was this study on what to find the normal young man, but they only studied approximately 300 Harvard male undergraduates, and they were all young, white, native-born, intelligent, and physically fit. So, like, they left out anything that wasn't the ideal that they were trying to create. It's not an actual measurement of the average human being. It's decidedly not. It's drawing from a pool of the ideal that they that they already had in mind, right? And then claiming that this was normal, that this was average.
Yeah, so, like, if this was a study that was the Grant study of Harvard men in 1945, sure. They got an average of the Harvard man in 1945. However, they called it the Grant study of normal young men and took such a small sample size. But this was a hugely influential study, which is why it's like a big deal at the time. People do shitty research all the time, but this one got so much attention that it adds kind of to this movement and moment of like creating a universalized normal in American pop culture. And so lastly, we get what Grinker cites as kind of the introduction and popularization of normal as a term to describe things in popular culture and not just as a statistical vocab word. Mm-hmm. So the best-selling book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, came out in 1948. This book was actually, I found this point really interesting because the book itself, I think in good faith, I haven't read the book Sexual Behavior in the Human Male from 1948, but from how Grinker describes it, the author, Kinsey, had, some good faith arguments. He was actually trying to find statistical norms.
Is this where the Kinsey scale comes from?
I don't know. What's the Kinsey scale?
The Kinsey scale that says that, human sexuality is a spectrum and some people are completely heterosexual or completely homosexual and that the majority of people are somewhere in the middle?
Maybe. I'm doing a quick Google. Yeah. The first reports, this is from, Wikipedia Kinsey scale article. The reports were first published in Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, 1948, by Alfred Kinsey, Wardell Pomeroy, and others. What a connection.
I never put that together while I was reading it. I was like, hold on, Kinsey. I've heard this word before.
Okay, so if you're aware of the Kinsey scale, this is where it comes from.
Oh my God.
And it's fascinating. This came out in the 1940s, right?
Yeah.
Like, not a time we associate with large acceptance of queerness. So this is what Grinker summarizes. Quote, Kinsey provided the remarkable statistic that 37% of the thousands of men he surveyed had at least once in their lives reached orgasm while in physical contact with another man. He said that homosexual sex was actually a statistical norm. Yet in this case, the, quote, normal was still a mark of shame. What we, quote, think is normal, Kinsey remarked, is often not what we actually do. And Grinker writes, the word normal was new to most readers, and so Kinsey tried hard to impress his own perspective, cautioning the reader against using normal and abnormal loosely in everyday language. But as we know, his argument backfired. So by going in and trying to look at the statistical norms of sexual behavior, Kinsey was coming out with some things that were not really accepted in the mainstream idea of what sexuality was. And so people latched onto these words normal and abnormal to use loosely, but also just threw away the other findings of his book. So Grinker uses all three of these examples as ways to kind of explain where the idea of normal came from in American culture and how we kind of grabbed onto these statistical words, but continue to use them in non-statistical ways. And that normal usually means what is accepted. And that's kind of how we got to this idea is normal equals accepted instead of normal equals statistical average.
It's so fascinating that this book, which is trying to, quote unquote, normalize something that's not accepted, has the opposite effect of people being like, well, I don't want to be that. So then they go to extremes to aspire to be quote unquote normal, to shift what normal is or something. I don't know. But, you know, if you think about the image we have of like the 1950s white family, there's nothing visibly wrong with you being perfect. Basically, we have this idea of the quote unquote American dream, right? As we of 2.5 kids is literally a statistical average of the average number of children.
You do not have half a child.
You do not have half a child, but that's what people say, right? 2.5 kids, house with a picket fence, dog, kids go to college, mom cooks dinner in kitten heels, and everyone in the community is perfect, and there's no problems, and right, it's this like, that idea comes from this obsession with normalcy in the 1950s. It's not actually, like, if you were to take the average of all American traits, citizens, non-citizens, every single race, class, education, everything, it would look very, very different. So yeah, so normal is not, it stopped being a statistical average and it became a kind of metaphor for whiteness, for this sort of white middle class dream. And it's not real, and it's not really something that anybody actually is. And so it's something that we punish ourselves. Well, I say we, I don't try to achieve that, but our culture suggests that you punish yourself to achieve this idea. And as we're about to get into, you know, this is not a new thing that whiteness is the sort of standard against which mental illness is created. That's like kind of where it came from.
So let's back up a bit to the beginning. As we mentioned, the definition of normal comes 130 pages into this book.
Yeah.
So we'll cover what those first 129 pages we're talking about. Where do we get the concept of mental illness, like, in the first place?
So there's a couple things that have to happen. First, you have to have the European idea of separating the mind from the body, that the mind and the body are not the same, that they're not an interconnected system, that they aren't one whole person, that they are separate entities. That the mind can get sick without the body being sick, and vice versa. That's not a universal idea, right? So that has to come first. And then we have this trend after Darwin published his ideas about the theory of evolution. There was this huge drive immediately after that to categorize all the things. There was this obsession with labeling and categorizing all of the things. They were like, we have to figure out how everything's related to each other and we have to put everything in their boxes, which is, it's a kind of a reaction against the original idea of evolutionary theory, which is that everything is interconnected, right? Everything comes from the common ancestor and all this kind of stuff. But instead they were like, no, we got to separate everything. We got to label everything, including people. This is happening at a similar time as colonization. And so race was not really a concept prior to this point, just like mental illness was not really a concept prior to this point. Basically, when they created race, it's this idea that physical features are connected to innate internal qualities, which is where you get these ideas of phrenology, which is the idea of like, oh, different skull shapes represent different racial lineages, but also that those skull shapes represent certain character traits, right? Are you more angry? Are you more meek? Are you more collectivist? Are you more independent? That kind of stuff. And that turned into physiognomy, which we see in literature a lot. So if you think of like Victorian literature, where they spend 5 pages describing a man's face, and you're just like, oh my God, why?
You're like, I did not care this much about a brow. I still don't care about this brow.
I still don't care about this brow. Like, why are we still talking about this? It's because they thought that the facial features represented, again, certain mental and moral qualities.
So it was like a character study. By describing their face, they're like giving you like, oh, these are some like criminal vibes.
Yes.
Getting some criminal vibes from this character study. But watch out, he might become a criminal.
Exactly. And something that blew my mind is that nose jobs were created as a mental health fix for rich people. Because they were like, if we change the shape of your nose, gonna fix what's going on in your emotions and your brain.
But to be fair, that may be a reason many people still get nose jobs. It's for different reasons,
true.
kind of. Like, they're probably explaining it differently. But that is interesting that they were like, if we change the shape of your nose, it will change you. Whereas, like, now it's kind of like, I feel bad. I want to change the shape of my nose because I think it'll make me feel better.
That is interesting. So we have the creation of different races, right? We have this idea that what you look like represents what's inside. And then we have the invention of capitalism, which is happening at the same time, where the value of a person was turned into their productivity. We had to find some place to put all the people who couldn't work or who wouldn't work. And so that's when they created asylums.
Yeah, I thought this part was interesting in the book, too. He talks about, like, the community care that might have happened beforehand, right? So if you're like running your own, I don't know, weaving studio out of your home and your cousin needs more care, but you can keep them in the house helping with some of the smaller tasks and they're cared for, it's not a problem. You know, it's just cousin Joe over there doing his thing. But then when it becomes we're working in factories, I have to leave the home to go work. I can't leave cousin Joe on his own. And in capitalism, my productivity is, necessary to have social value and money to live. Therefore, someone has to do something with Joe. So we just throw him into asylum now because he's not working enough on his own, or for people who cannot work. And then, I mean, the whole section on like the number of reasons and like situations that people were thrown into asylums is like horrifying and sad. I mean, for any reason to be thrown into these asylums because they were super abusive and people were just being like experimented on with like no consent and like couldn't leave. But even, some of the reasons people were thrown in there, it wasn't like a small handful of extreme cases. It was like any and every reason that we want to hide someone or get them out of our way. Our society just threw them into asylums.
Yeah, I mean, it became a way for the state to control populations, but it also became a way to deal with shame in a family, or it could just be, a family really doesn't want to put their family member in an asylum, but they can't afford to care for them, and so there's all these different layers, but madness for a long time was just defined as anything kind of undesirable. So it was women who weren't docile and submissive. It was maybe colonial subjects or slaves who refused to comply with orders. There was a literal diagnosis for a while that was runaway slave disease. Literally a diagnosis. And then physically disabled people who were not productive enough were also thrown in there. Yeah. It could be anyone. So that is kind of the cultural soup from which mental illness emerges as an idea.
Like defined as a thing that can be sorted and categorized.
Yes, exactly. It became a category of people. And then for a while we thought of the madness was due to a moral failing of character, usually caused by having too much sex or sexual appetite.
Or surprisingly not enough sex.
Yes!
Like the list of reasons that people were like moral failing was like too much sex, not enough sex.
Yeah.
Too much food, not enough food.
Yeah.
Too smart, not smart enough.
Yeah. So you can kind of see this idea of normal being the sort of pathway being paved in a way where it's like both ends of any moral spectrum were considered problematic. And the things that they associated with any fun or flavor in food or a variety of things to sexual appetite and moral failing. And so these guys in the Midwest tried to invent super, super bland foods to treat their asylum patients because they thought if there was too much flavor in their food, they would go crazy. And so that's where we get graham crackers and cornflakes.
They do not teach you this, I will say, at Cereal City, USA in Battle Creek, Michigan. Grew up going there as field trips. They do not talk about the fact that cornflakes were created to prevent masturbation. They don't tell children that, and I'm shocked. If I would have known, I don't know what I would have done. I probably would have been scared. I was like 7. I didn't know what was going on. But cornflakes are so bland. Like the only good cornflakes are for is to use them in other flavorful recipes to give you a crunch.
And then the graham crackers that we have today with like the honey flavor, the honey glaze, were not.
Yeah, imagine like what we have for texture, devoid of any flavor.
Yes.
that is the graham cracker of old.
Like eating cardboard. So it's just so funny to me that you grew up there. So now I just have this I just imagine little baby Victoria learning about cornflakes. And
we did.
Does she know? It's just great.
It's like folklore of the town. Everyone had to know.
Yeah.
So during this time is also when we get, I say this time generally, but where are we? Like the early 1900s at this point? We're starting to separate asylums away from prisons. So for a while, it was kind of one and the same, you know, the criminal and the criminally insane or whatever, all end up in these terrible like asylums. Prisons are kind of one and the same, but we start separating them out and realizing like, okay, let's put criminals in one place and people who are mentally ill in another place.
As a little aside, I'm not a big Foucault fan, but if you are, he's done a ton of research on this particular topic of separating asylums and prisons. He wrote a book on the history of madness in Europe and then a book on prisons and punishment and all that kind of stuff. So this is very much his wheelhouse that Grinker is drawing on here. So then as we transition into the 1900s, we get all these big-ass wars. As a result of the 2 world wars and the invention of psychoanalysis in Europe, which happened around a similar time, mental illness began to be treated as kind of a separate kind of condition from physical or social or moral illnesses. And so that's when we get the inventions of these new drugs and therapies to treat, you know, traumatized soldiers, and the gradual shift of mental illness from a thing that quote-unquote crazy people have to a thing that anyone can be born with or can be diagnosed with due to difficult circumstances. But the ideas about what mental illness is and where it comes from are constantly shifting.
Yeah, which is honestly a lot of what Grinker is tracking in this book, is like how we have changed these ideas over time and kind of tracking different like trains of thought. One thing I thought was pretty interesting is he talks about kind of in the giant section on like war psychology, the ebb and flow of like learning and then forgetting, you know, like all this psychoanalysis work and psychiatry was developed during World War I, that not too long after World War II comes around and it's like we never knew. He says basically that like a lot of the way the military operated, the way people approach these topics, it was as if we hadn't learned anything in World War I when World War II started. And yeah, I think kind of harkens to that post-war period where you just want to like forget things, it seems like. So yeah, let's dig in a little bit more. How does the presentation of madness or illness change in different places, in different cultures, in different times? And like, where does Grinker eventually bring us? What does it look like in the US today?
We can sort of track the way that there have been different culturally accepted sort of presentations of illness over time. So if you think about like, you read a Victorian novel and everyone's like fainting all the time because they walked in the rain for 5 minutes and you're just like, what? You know? And, you know, that was a period where tuberculosis was sort of glorified and certain emotions were not allowed to be presented. And so everything had to be some kind of, there were certain socially accepted presentations of problems. And so that's what you got in that era. Whereas in World War I, you have shell shock, right? Which men were very twitchy and didn't have a lot of motor control and had trouble talking sometimes as a result of trauma from fighting in the First World War. But it's interesting that the idea of trauma as a result of war is carried through, right? We have this idea of PTSD now.
Post-traumatic stress disorder. Many listeners may be familiar, but yeah, if you're not, that's what it stands for.
But the symptoms of PTSD are extremely different from shell shock. And we have not seen those shell shock symptoms since. They have never reappeared. But the sort of central idea of PTSD has continued, but it presents very differently now.
Yeah, and so I found this really insightful, I guess. Like, a lot of the things in this book, besides, like, specific historical things, like Kinsey published whatever book, I didn't know that. But a lot of the ideas, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Oh, I guess I kind of knew that, but I never connected these dots.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was a big one for me as far as a new learning around the presentation of mental illness can look so different across cultures and across time. And, like, I don't know, it reminds me in small ways of my own experience, right? Where like, or a very common experience for people who menstruate, which is the first time it happens to you, even if you've been told what to expect, you're like terrified. You're like, I have no idea what this is. I think I'm dying. And that's like your body's like expression at the time and your mind trying to figure out what's going on. But then you get some answers because you talk to the people and you're like, oh, that's how it typically is. Like once you have a diagnosis for something, you can kind of understand what's happening more. You have more context. But then there's this interesting thing he highlights too of like people explain their symptoms using words they know, which may mean they leave out some symptoms or they might categorize that symptom as something else.
The example I always think of first is when we read The Wisdom of Your Body. Dr. Hilary McBride, she talks about working with a hospital to help treat patients with heart conditions. And a lot of them are middle-aged men who have never been allowed to process and share and experience their feelings. And so it turns into this kind of low-level stress on the body that breaks down organs and a lot of times can turn into a heart condition. So in our culture, it was often more socially acceptable to have a physical ailment in our sort of science-based, evidence-based culture, right? Having a physical ailment is respected. It's going to get you help and treatment and sympathy and social support, and it's going to be acknowledged. It's going to be labeled with a term that is institutionally recognized, right? Where there's treatment and research on it and all this kind of stuff. Whereas you think about like depression in different times in different places has been called various different things. And so for some people, you know, there's an experience for a lot of people who have had some kind of depression or anxiety their whole lives where they think that it's a heart condition or that it's irritable bowel syndrome or that it's some kind of lack of appetite or that it's a thyroid issue or it's an energy issue. Like there's so many different physical things that maybe in a particular family are more socially acceptable expressions of feelings, trauma, whatever. And so that's what the body shows, but that's also what the people around them are willing to see and to name. So it sort of goes both ways. Right? Bodies are going to do what they're going to do in order to be recognized, but also we're going to see what we want to see.
I am constantly coming back to anytime I have this like mental confusion around these topics and I'm like, I don't quite understand, or I'm having a hard time articulating. I'm realizing it's again my like, I've been steeped in Western culture, dividing my mind and my body, and so I have a really hard time talking about it.
Yeah.
As like a connected thing. Like it's a real physical experience these people had, even if these symptoms don't present in the same way as they do now. It was both mental and physical because they experienced it in their body, which is everything. Yeah. They are one thing. But we like to parse it out and try to understand it as just a thing and name just that one thing as what is affecting their well-being.
Mm-hmm. It's complicated. It's very, our language is not great for talking about it.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of sounds like not real when we use our words. Our language is also culturally specific in a particular time and place, that this is how we talk about these kinds of things and this is what we mean when we say these words.
Yeah, so like when we try to, in US culture, try to like export our mental health care or our research or our understanding to other cultures, it can be reductionist and harmful to come in, even with the best intentions, and say, this is what PTSD is in Cambodia or something like that. A different culture that has different expressions and language and understanding of mental illness, and that we can't just wholesale like apply our cultural context onto a different culture.
The most recent movement in the US to reduce stigma has been to use what Grinker calls a brain-based model, where it basically says that these mental illnesses are innate. They are a part of me. It's a sort of born this way kind of idea, right? Which is something in the US we've often used to reduce stigma, where it's like, this is me, this is who I am, you can't change it, you don't have to fix me, just accept me as I am, kind of thing. It's a push to reduce stigma and also to remove blame from mothers, usually. Because that's where often the blame goes, right? If we say in the US that something is culturally or socially created, a lot of times it turns into mother blaming, which we're trying not to do. So, you know, in the US, we're like, oh, if we use this model, this helps reduce stigma. And then we import it somewhere else, and it does not work. He gives a bunch of examples. A Nepalese psychiatrist who was like trained in, I think in Europe, but he translates all, like, the language that he was given in his training just didn't work for his own people. And so he used different words, language that people could relate to, because he was moving this European conception of the body and the mind into a culture that had different divisions there were different types of minds. And so he couldn't just use a literal translation. He had to understand, what are people going to relate to and what are people going to receive so that we can help each other.
Another example he gives, Grinker talked to and interviewed a lot of people in Korea about autism. And in Korea, genetic disorders hold a lot more stigma than social caused disorders, mainly because in their culture, matchmaking is very, like, that's kind of the way that people are introduced to each other to consider marriage. An outside matchmaker makes the match. And if there's a large weight on, like, compatibility, and if there's a genetic disorder in one of the families, it's basically sentencing the rest of that family and their children to little or no marriage prospects. So it's like a big deal. Like, if a Korean mother is often specifically ask for, and clinicians often give, a diagnosis for what essentially translates to, like, bad parenting disease for the autistic children, because they take the shame on themselves as mothers, which is still very shameful.
Yeah.
That disorder and that disease in their family, but it avoids the stigma of a genetic condition that would harm other people in their family from matchmaking opportunities. And so in that case, a brain-based model was not going to fly, and instead they could use a different diagnosis for what we would see as kind of the same thing, autism, but they use a different diagnosis in the cultural context.
I don't know if the matchmaker thing is current, but that's kind of where it comes from.
And this is based on his research, I'm assuming, since the 90s. So I'm
Yeah.
This is an example of a point in time in Korean culture, not
Yes.
like this is how it always is.
And then he references someone else's, a Japanese anthropological study of depression, that sort of looks at how depression as a diagnosis appears and disappears in their culture based on stigma and social meaning. And so there was a period where they defined depression by the American model of this, like, innate and incurable condition. And it had so much stigma that no one could, like, afford to be depressed socially. And so the diagnosis just disappeared. But now it has this new social association in that the image of it is an overworked businessman, where he's not depressed because there's something wrong with his brain, but he's depressed because his work is too stressful, right? And so it has this association with a common figure that you see a lot, right, who's relatively successful, and it's situational. And so the diagnosis is more common again as a result. So these are just a couple of examples, but there's tons more in the book, but these are specific to, like, how our current model of mental illness is extremely specific to us and our language and our context, and even this particular period of time, because it's not even the one that we've always used.
I guess this kind of leads us to, like, the question, how do we continue to break down the stigma of mental illness? So we've spent a lot of time talking about where it came from and what the stigma can do. It can keep people from reporting their experiences or reaching out for help because of the stigma. Yeah, how can we break down the stigma and push back on the concept of normal as, like, a thing to be desired?
Yeah. What we're doing right now is normalizing it. You think about millennials and especially Gen Z, where, like, we refer to our therapists by their first names, and they come up a lot. I know the first name of Victoria's therapist. She knows the first name of mine. And, we share tips that we get from therapy, and it's very much like, oh yeah, we're, jokes about how we're all mentally ill, all this kind of stuff. We're sort of, it's a normal thing to do. But it's unclear whether that is enough, right? Because it's still referring to it as something innate in us that we can't fix. We can just sort of learn to deal with better and embrace and accept about ourselves, which is an important step. But it doesn't necessarily acknowledge the sort of social, institutional, cultural factors, which are, I would say, equally important. I think Grinker also makes that argument, is that it's kind of a both and.
It's how we talk to each other, but also, like, how we set up our society. And many people have more or less power to influence how our society is set up. Another big takeaway for me in this book was kind of the history of institutionalization in the US. I guess I was like aware of in broad strokes, but I hadn't connected a lot of dots to today. And like, which is my favorite thing to do with history is like, oh, that's really cool to learn about. And then all of a sudden you like, and this impacted this, which impacted this, which impacted this. And now it's 2023 and this is why it's the way it is. And we're like, oh, that's where that came from. I think one of the ways to characterize the American relationship to mental health care and caring for those who are mentally ill, it's been a very like all or nothing approach. And we've tried dramatically different things, which I don't want to reduce too much because there's a lot of people who spent a lot of time and many decades working in this space to make incremental progress. But in many ways, it also just seems like these were well-intentioned but not well executed when we had big changes in mental health care. So like in the, decades before Julie and I were born, there were like these big changes that have direct consequences on how we understand and treat mentally ill people today in 2023. In a very reductive summary of deinstitutionalization, which is like the closure of all these asylums. Like if you're like, why did we used to have all these asylums in the US and then where did they go? So one of his like last acts before he was assassinated, JFK set in motion the closure of institutions and asylums in the US. And this is at the same time that antipsychotic medication was available for the first time, and it allowed patients a path back into society. So Grinker has a lot of examples in his book of people who worked at asylums or people who studied them. And there was kind of this understanding of like, if you were brought to an asylum, like you're never leaving. Like this is where your road ends for you. And this was the time that through policy and medical interventions, there was a path out of these very abusive places. However, at the same time, there was not a plan for all these people, at least on broad scale. On a broad scale, it was just kind of, you have meds now, and legally other things are happening in the US that made it stricter, that you can't hold people against their will. That's a great thing. We don't want illegal imprisonment. But that's it. It was kind of like you're on your own. There wasn't like large scale opportunities for these people who had previously been, for some of them, spent their entire lives in an asylum and then suddenly were dumped back into society. So for many, being back with family and having these medications was what they needed, and it was allowed them to have a better quality of life. But we've also lead us to where we are today with this. For me, this was a light bulb moment. For others, it may seem like duh. But we have in our culture this kind of implicit understanding that when we see a homeless person, we assume mental illness. Or we associate them so closely that we assume anyone who's homeless is mentally ill. Even if maybe they aren't. Maybe there's other reasons they're homeless. But at the same time that we like have this association, we still blame the individual for being, quote, lazy or stupid or, not being smart enough to figure out how to get out of their situation. We blame the individual even though we understand there's this really, really close correlation of mental illness and homelessness. And on top of that, as a society, we want, like, there's been so much discourse of, like, okay, what do we do in the cities that are, like, there's so many homeless people, and there's people who, like, homeowners in many places that are very vocal about, like, how much they don't want these homeless people around, but there isn't really a solution, except, as a society, we then incarcerate people for petty crime. And so many homeless people end up in prison for nonviolent and petty crimes. So basically we're back kind of, I don't want to say we haven't made progress, but in a way we seem to be where we were like 100 years ago when criminals and the mentally insane were in the same place, which is prison.
I mean, yeah. And if you think about rates of incarceration for different races and classes and, mental illnesses and disabilities, very, very similar. In many ways, that has been the solution in the US, is to have more people in prison than anywhere else on the planet.
This idea of like homelessness being so closely tied with mental illness, like I was surprised and then immediately not surprised that this idea isn't a universal thing at all. Remember, like this is all within our cultural context. This is distinct for our moment in time with our culture in the US. Grinker gives this example. Nakamura, a Japanese researcher, notes that, unlike in the United States, in Japan, antipsychotic medicines did not result in deinstitutionalization or the development of a community mental health system. Institutionalization of people with serious mental illnesses continues today, which is one reason why Japanese don't assume that people who are homeless have severe and chronic mental illness. If they did, they'd likely be in a hospital somewhere. Instead, the typical person thinks first that the homeless person has suffered terrible financial losses, has trauma from the brutal university exam system, or has been abandoned due to their old age. Just like a reminder of like, oh right, it hasn't always been this way, and does it have to continue this way? Like, no, other cultures do things differently. People in general control our culture. Individuals have more or less power to make change. So anyways, these were a lot of my like rambling epiphanies and thoughts, and like imagine the meme of the mental map, like just like piecing it all together and being like JFK, deinstitutionalization, medicine, homelessness, incarceration. So I guess, where does this lead us now? Like what can we do instead?
The two solutions that we've sort of listed, right? First, there's just like, we gotta get rid of the asylums, and we didn't really make a plan beyond that. That was one solution. And then now it's like, everyone's mentally ill. That's another solution. Again, very all or nothing. These don't necessarily help reduce stigma. They just kind of shift it. And so it feels like we have farther to go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like we have all the answers, obviously. And no. Grinker's book doesn't really have all the answers either. It doesn't quite come to a conclusion. He really likes the concept of neurodiversity, which is the idea that there's a natural biodiversity of minds and bodies. And he emphasizes the dignity of risk, meaning that people with different mental health problems or disabilities should be allowed to be their own people and make their own mistakes. We shouldn't try to control everything about a person's life, that they should be allowed to be a person. And we still have this underlying sense in our culture, in our medical practices of trying to fix everything. And it's A, not possible, and B, not very fulfilling. Those are sort of the thoughts he leaves us with, but he doesn't quite come to a conclusion either. So, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, in our conversations, like prepping for this episode and just now recording, I come back to like this importance of community, that relational aspect of mental health and interdependence, right? So when we tried in history to let's put away all the people who are not contributing to our capitalist culture so we don't have to look at them, we were isolating them and setting them up for abuse. And then when we said, oh, these institutions are really abusive, we should close them, we didn't set up a system for people to be in community. So some people who happened to have a family that was welcoming them back in, or happened to find a program or a place that was a good fit for them, found that, but others were left to struggle on their own and continue to do so. And I think it's coming together in our communities, which is maybe too kumbaya of me to assume it's going to be very easy. I don't want to make it seem like it will be, but I think ultimately with the idea of stigma and normalization and what do we want to normalize as a society, those are such big questions. I think I come back to this more like, okay, what can I do here? Which is recognize where I crave support and acceptance in my own community, and how can I offer that support and acceptance to those around me. At least that's where I will start.
Yeah, I feel like part of it is as voting citizens of a society, maybe trying to provide more public supports to help reduce barriers to care, providing housing, providing something for people to live off of so that they can afford to take care of themselves and be reintegrated into community. I feel like there's that level. And there's not a one size fits all for that, but whatever we're doing is not it. And then, yeah, I agree on like the personal level. I think I was really impressed in this book with the realization of how much our bodies speak. And everything they're saying is just this sort of desperation for community and care and acceptance. And it's going to do whatever it needs to do in order to be loved. I feel like we can follow that and say, okay, that is what our body's goal is. So maybe that should also be our goal for ourselves and the people that we're connected to. We're not going to be perfect. We're not going to have the perfect language, right? We're steeped in our own culture and our own language and context and whatever. But if we have that understanding that it's like, things are not just one thing, which is, a symptom is not just the symptom. it is part of a whole person. And a diagnosis is not just a diagnosis, right? It is culturally contextual. And we can try to take better care of each other and be more accepting of things not fitting into distinct boxes, you know? Like, that was where mental illness came from, was putting everything in these little boxes.
Yeah.
And maybe we shouldn't, you know, I feel that instinct a lot of times is like, I need to categorize this. I need to put parameters around this so I can understand it. And, you know, maybe push back on that.
Yeah. I think for me in my own, like, mental health journey, I feel on a minuscule level the desire for a box, the desire to understand what's going on and to have a name for it and to be able to explain it to people and say, I'm not okay. Because I went to therapy being like, I'm not okay and I don't know what's wrong and I'm scared. This is terrifying. I hate it. I just want to be quote unquote normal and figure out what that means for me. And then I got a diagnosis and a label and like understanding like, oh, that's what I am. Cool. But, you know, some days if I'm feeling not like opening up to someone, but it becomes relevant to talk about having anxiety, I can just let it land and they can take it how they want. You know, like their interpretation of what it means to be in therapy or have anxiety or whatever. It might be really different than my own experience, but some days I'm like, I'm too tired to like, this is not I don't know you well enough to talk about this. But it also reminds me too that like, okay, now that I have this box, sometimes I get annoyed with the box. Yeah. And I also realize my box isn't the same as another box that someone else has that has the same name on it. And that like a more, at least in close relationship, again, in that safety of community or that structure of community, in a friendship, in a relationship, you can talk about like, oh, this is what anxiety looks like for me. This is what it feels like. This is how it manifests in my life. This is what, you know, makes it better or makes it worse. How is it for you? And understanding that their diagnostic label, while that person might share the same one, being open to understanding that it's like completely different. And I think anxiety is like a vague enough diagnosis that like many of us can be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's really different than yours. But even I think diagnoses that I'm less familiar with that I assume is a very like specific thing. Like in Grinker's book, he talks a lot about the debate of what to call post-traumatic stress disorder, because people were trying to narrow it in, like, oh, it's a war thing, it's a combat thing, and is it a disorder, yes or no? And like, I think letting go of preconceived notions. If someone tells me and they decide to disclose, like, oh, I have PTSD, I'm not going to make assumptions about like what that looks like in their life. And maybe if we, you know, build a relationship, they would be interested, and if they want, you know, they can share what that looks like in their life. But also I can also just take the label and know like, sounds like you sometimes go through a difficult time. How can we build community for you, even if I don't need to know all the details?
There's a bigger cultural acceptance still of discrete boxes and diagnoses, because that's what gets treatment and that's what is seen as valid still. And so it's complicated, you know?
Yeah, because we're still tied up in our culture, right? And in our culture, you have to have a specific diagnosis to receive certain accommodations and certain healthcare and certain insurance things and whatnot, to get certain prescription medications. Like, you have to have the label in the box because our culture is set up around labels and boxes.
You got to start small. You got to start with your relationship to yourself and your relationship to the people closest to you, where I feel like that's where you can start. Because they know you and your behavior and your context well enough that you can start to push back on the kind of rules that we use to communicate with people we don't know very well. It's where we got to start, because you can't just change a whole thing overnight. Yeah.
It's funny, we were critiquing that Grinker doesn't quite land somewhere with us. Yeah. And then we were both like, we can land this episode. And then we just like stumbled to the ground and we're like, and that's the end.
Like, I don't know, man. We're still figuring it out. We can give some recommendations of people who are talking about this subject. We mentioned The Wisdom of Your Body by Dr. Hillian McBride. That's a big one. We have an episode on that.
And that one has a little more like interactive reflection. Definitely a very different type of book than this one is. It's a heavy one too, so give yourself some time to work through it on your own pace if you are yourself unpacking traumas or mental illness.
Yeah, sort of a companion piece. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He actually does something very similar, tracking the history of specifically of the diagnosis of PTSD and his experience working with children and trying to get a diagnosis into the DSM and it not happening. So it's a good thing to read after this one.
A less academic, maybe a little more general audience book, Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle by Emily Nagoski and Amelia Nagoski. We talked about it here on the podcast, but this idea of what it means to complete a stress cycle and let stress move through your body physically and mentally was a big, I don't know, it was, what was it, Julia, 2 years ago we first came across this concept, and then you and I were like, couldn't stop talking about it. That's a good read. And then lastly, a little bit of partial self-promotion. I worked with a wonderful team, including Julia, on a audio series called Roadmap to Resilience, supporting children experiencing stress and trauma. Julia and I were the podcast marketing support. We were not, in fact, the trauma experts. So you can listen to 19 or 20 fantastic trauma researchers, advocates, and mental health providers from around the world talking about how to support children specifically, but a lot of insight for anyone who's supporting others in their life or themselves through stress and trauma. It was a pretty cool project to be involved with. I feel like I learned a lot. Okay, our final segment, Currently Obsessed, things that are bringing us joy in this current time and place.
I recently finished all my finals, and while I was working on those, I watched both seasons of the K-drama Hospital Playlist on Netflix. I needed something feel-good to deal with my stressed out brain, and it's about 5 friends who are surgeons, and it's it's in a hospital. It's surprisingly very easy on the nerves. And then I'm also currently planning a trip to Taiwan in the next few weeks, and I am stoked. I'm so excited. I'm gonna eat so much food. It's gonna be
I'm so excited for you. I've only been in the Taipei airport. I don't know anything about Taiwan.
Yeah. How about you?
So I'm currently reading No Cure for Being Human and Other Truths I Need to Hear by Kate Bowler. I'm reading it for an in-person book club. And it's been a really good read. Kate Bowler is a wonderful writer. It's a memoir-style book. And so the other night, my partner was like, oh, we should plan our date night tomorrow night. And I was like, cool. And he's like, how about we both just say a thing and we go do both the things? Maybe this is showing our late 20s age, but we were remarking the other weekend that we never do more than a thing in a day. We used to do many things in a day. And we're like, what if we plan a date night that takes us to 2 locations? How fun would that be?
A secondary location?
A secondary location? The joke is that we didn't actually go to the secondary location because we got tired. But before he told me this was for date night, he said, think of a thing you want to do together. And so I, in my mind, was like, let's go to Paris. That was the first thought I had. And so I laughed really hard when he's like, we'll do it tomorrow. And I'm like, sure, let's go to Paris. So what we did do was there's a really nice French restaurant here in Chicago called Le Bouchon. I don't know how to say it. I'm not French. The whole time I felt like an imposter because I could not order anything off the menu without just pointing at it and be like, I would like this one. I digress. But we had a great time. And then in the vibes of going to the Chicago version of Paris, we were listening to the French indie music playlist on Spotify. And I realized I really like it. It's good vibes. And I don't understand a word they're saying. And so I can just put it on anytime I want, even when I'm working, which I know is a thing that many people do with foreign language music, but I am slow. I only listen to things that aren't in English that Julia sends me. And then I'm like, oh, I have to say something back to Julia about what I think of this music, so I do have to listen to it intensely.
Well, I hope everyone listening can be well.
Stay abnormal.
Stay abnormal, friends.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at Book Club with JV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.